Everyone, good evening. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on this very sunny May evening. I'm delighted to welcome you all on behalf of the How To Academy. I'm very grateful that we can all come together in this way and bring brilliant speakers to you with the click of a Zoom button. I think adapting to our current situation and finding new ways to put on and engage in events like this online means we're already taking a big leaf out of the book that is our inspiration for this evening, which is How to Survive: Lessons for Everyday Life from the Extreme World. I've learned so much from reading it and underlined and highlighted almost every line. So I'm thrilled that we can welcome its author, who is a man who we really should be listening to when it comes to all matters survival, from the extreme to the everyday. John, thank you so much for joining us. John, of course, is the UK's chief military survival instructor, and his specialist works takes him to some of the most remote and extreme environments around the globe. So we are very lucky to have you here today in your lovely glamorous armchair. I'm going to do as little of the talking as I possibly can, just ask you questions for the next 40 minutes perhaps, and then everyone who is out there listening, you'll have a chance to ask your questions. I'm sure you've got many, so if you store them up as we go along, and then at the end I'll invite you to start typing them up, and we'll try and get as many in as possible. So thank you all for coming, and thank you, John. I said it's a brilliant guide to all situations, your book, and it's of course incredibly relevant to now. And there's an appendix which we'll come to at the back, which is how to cope with the pandemic. But you wrote it before this crisis. Who is it aimed at, and what did you want people to take away from it?
Well, thanks very much for having me, Hannah, and it's a real pleasure to chat to how-toers, because I'm a big how-to person myself, so hopefully lots of kindred spirits out there. I wrote the book because I've been doing this survival stuff for a long time, 20 years pretty much, teaching survival to survival instructors to pass on. And the way that we deliver that training is really simplistic. We're teaching people who've got incredibly busy day jobs, fighter pilots or people on the very edges of performance, and their heads are full. So the last thing they need is loads and loads of new things that they have to remember on top of their day job, because we're giving them hacks for when the world goes wrong. And because it's a really simplistic way of dealing with problems, what I've found is that I've instinctively over the last 20 years just begun using them outside of the normal wilderness context and in the everyday context. And it was a conversation with the publishers and my agent Joe. We decided that it would be a nice thing to capture all that and to pass that sort of information, those hard yards on. That was the idea for the original book. And then, as you say, there's a free ebook that people can download whenever they want that's dealing just with the current situation and applying those premises to this scenario.
And you say it's not a traditional survival manual, you'll say that. In fact, you say the world's had enough of those already. And in all likelihood, we won't be using it. The people that you're writing for won't be using it in a life-threatening situation, you hope or assume. But it is packed full of stories of extreme cases of real bravery and hardship and struggle. Why do you use those when they're not potentially relatable to a lot of people?
I love stories, and when I'm teaching at work, we always try to make the information as sticky as possible. And as a species, we've just evolved for millennia to pass things on through this sort of the oral tradition around the campfire, which is where I spend my evenings when I'm working teaching instructors in the woods. Very kind of old school, sitting around the campfire, spinning dits as we call it, sharing stories. And what I've found over the years, certainly from a recipient's point of view initially when I was being taught all this stuff, is the bits I remembered were the bits that were tagged to someone's hard-won experience. It's a wise person who learns from their own mistakes, but a wiser one who learns from the mistakes of others. So the book, I decided to do what I do in the woods in the book and include lots of stories that I personally find fascinating because they illustrate the point so well, I think. There are countless stories we could use. These are just my personal favorites, and I encourage everyone to kind of find their own palette to make things memorable. But yeah, that was the idea behind it, was to kind of give a crash bang wallop. There's a guy ejecting out of a stealth bomber in the middle of the night. How does that affect how you go to an airport in a foreign country? And if you can build a bridge between an explosive, dynamic, life-threatening event and unpack those ideas and work out what the premises that are at play are, how they're involved, how we can reverse engineer those to make our own lives easier, then it's a win-win. And I'm personally much more likely to remember them if I think about the 3 Australians in the outback or Amelia Earhart, rather than trying to go through the normal kind of military approach, which is to remember a list, a checklist, or God forbid, even a mnemonic that you have to then unpack and remember. I hate those, really hate that list-based learning. Excuse me. So I've found stories to be a very, very effective way of both passing information and, for me personally, just to make it lodge in my brain. So that's why I use the structure for every chapter of what I think is a cool story, what they did and why, and then ultimately from that, how we can all apply that. Because this book, to answer your first question more fully, I wrote this book for everybody. I've written the UK military survival manual about 10 years ago, and that's a very nuts and bolts, military sort of ABC, how to do things in adverse conditions. This is much more for everyone, because the skills are involved. There's no such thing as a superhuman born survivor. There really isn't. There's stuff we can all learn and we can all apply to make our own lives easier and our own performance better. So that was the kind of logic behind it. I think stories make information more sticky.
So you say everyone can adopt that mindset, and we can all be better at developing the sort of mindset that allows us to make decisions under pressure. For example, the practical world of the military survival, your words, is about learning a single simple template that can be transposed anytime and anywhere. So what is, obviously we will explore it further, but what is the essence of this military survival mindset that you want people to take into their everyday life?
There's a few different angles, and like you say, we'll probably end up digging into the different sort of spokes of the wheel as we go. But ultimately, we've got to, for our students, and therefore the things that I've translated into the writing, for our students, we've got to make things dead simple. And by simplifying things down to its core essence, we can then take that little survival tablet and perform better in the wild. And so, for example, I've done a bit of survival telly, and that's great fun, a really exciting, interesting, mad challenge. But that tends to focus on bushcraft, which is living like a First Nation person, kind of knowing lots about that specific environment, rubbing sticks together to light fires, that kind of thing, which is fantastic. And it's a great pastime for people who want to be out there. But the difficult part and the different part for military survival is that the guys that we're training, they do not want to go camping that day. They're camping because something incredibly bad has happened, probably after an explosion, and they're away from their mates. So they're camping on their own, away from their mates. Oh, and they haven't got a tent. They haven't got any camping kit. They're just living by their wits. So they are kind of involuntary practitioners of extreme camping. What we have to do is give them the absolute foundations to build their shelters on, and that is psychological. So most of the stuff in the book is how to retune your brain to perform better in adversity. And the key part for me, which is the bit that I find most interesting, because all survival stories have a kind of an arc, a beginning, middle, end, a preparation and planning phase, which is crucial. But the bit I like the most to dig into is after there's been the crash bang wallop and people have come to terms with what's gone on, how do they persevere? What do they do to spark that motivation and keep the engine turning so that they can carry on putting the effort in until they get rescued? And that is completely different from bushcraft, because bushcraft, you go into the woods or the wilderness, you're going there on purpose, you're doing it not by accident, and you're trying to learn stuff from best practices of the locals. What we're doing with military survival is giving people hacks so that they can survive and get rescued absolutely anywhere. So that's desert, Arctic, jungle, at sea, on land. And the other bits towards the back of the book, it's peace and wartime, because there are things that we can learn from evading hostile humans that we can definitely translate into the workplace or even online. It all carries across. So in principle, it's a very long-winded answer, Hannah, but in principle, it's those sorts of bits that we can all apply to perform better in adverse scenarios that we weren't necessarily expecting, but that we do have to persevere through. And we've all encountered those. Most of us are sort of in a version of that at the moment, which I think is why it's fairly interesting at the moment to chat about it, because we're all experiencing our own version of hardship at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And you talk about unexpected. It's the unexpected that we're all, trying to work out how to deal with, not least now. And you concentrate a lot on that, which is, the idea of being able to prepare your brain prepare your brain for these things. The idea that we can mold our brains and that, you know, we can sort of, I think you say load our system with comparable ideas. So we may not be able to prepare exactly for these situations. And especially now, I don't think anyone could really have predicted this and where we would be. But you say that we actually have the ability to make decisions and preload our brains with this comparable ideas. What do you mean by that? And how do we do that? Because we're certainly, all of us, groping around now with a very unexpected scenario.
Yeah, so if you wouldn't mind indulging me one of the stories, I think that might help to explain what I'm kind of on about. So early on in the book, in one of the best case examples I know of preparation for, and by preparation, I'll be clear, I don't mean prepping as it is in common media, where you kind of retreat to a mountaintop or a remote woodland and bury a tank and a load of guns and rice. That kind of worst case doomsday scenario prepping is not what we're talking about. We're just simply talking about putting the right files in our computer so that on the day of the race, we've got something to access rather than generating novel solutions to very dynamic events which we can't really keep up with. So the best example I know of that is an American gentleman called Dale Zelko. And if you think back to the late 90s, stealth fighters, the little black pointy triangular aeroplanes, they were considered by the media and certainly by the wider population to be invisible, invulnerable almost. And they were out prosecuting missions over hostile territory, and everyone thought that they were completely beyond reach. Well, Dale was flying one of those, and he knew that stealth fighters aren't invisible. They're just really, really, really hard to see. So that isn't the same. What that means to Dale is he knows there's a really small chance that he could be seen. So the night he's flying across Eastern Europe in March 1999, he's wearing 3 pairs of socks. You think, well, it's cozy and warm in an aeroplane. Why would I wear 3 pairs of socks? Dale's wearing 3 pairs of socks because he knows there's a vanishingly small chance that he might have to walk home that night. You know, if something goes really badly wrong, he could be on Shanks's ponies to get back. So that wasn't the only thing that he did. Every time he went through what he would do, I think this is the key bit that we can apply to these current situations and our day-to-day as it is now and as it will become. So we think about, Dale thought about what if, and by discussing with his crewmates on squadron before he flew that night, and writing something down, note to self, what I'll do if, he had a little plan in his head. That's all he did. The last survival training is, I would know it, SEER training as it's called in the military, but the last time he did any practical stuff was 20 years before. So he's not done anything other than think about this for 20 years. On the night that he goes to drop his bomb on the target, unfortunately for him, he sees 2 massive flares from the low cloud, and these telegraph poles are flying towards him at Mach 3, and one of them hit his aeroplane. So he's been shot down by a surface-to-air missile. This all happened pretty quickly. The world did not think a stealth bomber could get shot down. Dale didn't really expect it, but he knew that it was a vanishingly small possibility, so he prepared. What happened next? Well, within about 2 seconds, he's ejected and he's under his parachute. He did that so quickly because it was drilled into him. So we can do things like that in a very practical way to do with fire escapes, but that's not kind of where this version of the story is going. What then happened was his parachute deployed and he's descending over enemy territory. And as he descends, he starts to look down and orientate himself, looking at the North Star and working out where things are. He notices he's going to land next to a very busy road. It's kind of back end of rush hour. People going into Belgrade, out of Belgrade. And the parachute that he's in is descending towards a road. So he steers away from the road and lands in the field. What's interesting about Dale's story, he spotted an opportunity on the ground. He saw a small hidey hole. Before he'd even done any of that, he got in touch with his mates. Now, I'm not going to ever mention anything that's kind of classified in these sorts of chats, but just to the point that we don't teach people to use their little survival radios while they're under the parachute. He's ejected, he's high over enemy territory, he's looking down at the ground, and he thinks, what can I do for the next couple of minutes while there's nothing else I can occupy my time with? So what he did, dug his radio out, rang for help. Right, so a fairly simple takeaway, but he would not have been able to have the mental capacity to do that had he not already unburdened his brain by the what-if thinking he did before the flight. So he's unloaded the back of his brain, he's got all that stuff in there, and he's given the front of his brain, the bit that deals with dynamic situations, the time to unpack what's happening around him and come up with a novel solution. So there's 2 bits to that, really. Key thing is, think ahead, have a little plan, and then you'll generate the capacity to deal with the truly novel ripostes on the spot, which is what he did. Spoke to his mates, gradually gets lower as the parachute descends and goes slightly more difficult to speak on the radio because the distances across the rough terrain are harder. Ends up on the ground. He got rescued that night, not because he did anything specifically special once he was on the ground, but because he had the foresight to ask for help early. What he managed to do during that descent was pick the right piece of ground, assess whether he could move or not. And this is the bit which leads into where we go next with this kind of potential easement of lockdown, I think, because once you've orientated yourself to the ground around you and you've got a little plan in place, you know how much you can do. Now, Dale's only job while he was on the ground for those 8 hours was just don't get caught. He didn't have to move anywhere. He didn't have to do anything. He just had to make sure he wasn't caught. And at times, dogs and soldiers came quite close to him, but he just did the right thing. And I think there's a metaphor in that for the current moment that isn't necessarily in the printed book, but that we can all transpose and apply. Because if we try to do too much, then it's difficult. And that's going to be true when we go back to our old normal, or as close as it will be. You've got to have a little plan. You've got to know what your vulnerabilities are, and you've got to understand that there's only so much you can achieve and that it's okay to ask for help straight away. The sooner you do it, the sooner you'll get it. So when I'm going to start going back from working from home and easing myself into the day job, I would be absolutely stupid to expect my performance to be the same as it was the day I left. Because I'm now adjusted to having an extra bit of time in the day, which would have been spent commuting, doing a lot more things like this, doing it remotely. And the face-to-face elements are going to be trickier because everything's going to have to be socially distanced. So I know that, like Dale, I need to build a what-if plan. So if I get called in to do a bit of teaching, how am I going to tackle that? We'll be able to incorporate distance methods into it. And I know that when I'm there, if I try to do too much, I'll only end up disappointing myself because I won't match that standard yet. I know that I will be able to eventually, but if I try to do it straight away, it'll be frustrating for me and probably frustrating for anyone who's listening to my lessons. So the key thing with all of this and looking at how people have tackled these things is to unburden your brain as much as you can by going through simple questions. And one of the ones in the preparation phase, which Dale epitomizes, is a vanishingly small likelihood of being shot down, but he still planned for what he would do if he was. Because of that, he had the spare mental capacity to deal with a really novel situation, and he got rescued. You know, it was a really brave move on the part of the rescuers, but it wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for Dale's forethought. So yeah, it's a very long answer, mate, but that's kind of working its way around, hopefully, to what you were getting at.
I think the thing that I questioned, when you try and foresee all the things that could go wrong,
yeah,
that's sometimes a sort of a quite, stressful sort of state to be in, and often I kind of think that's one way to go. I could plan for all the things that might go wrong and be as meticulous as possible, or just live in the moment and hope for the best. And sometimes I do think maybe more relaxing scenario is not to plan everything and make sure you have thought of every situation that could go wrong.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. There is a sweet spot, isn't there, between either end of the spectrum. A friend of mine, when I was going through flying training, had his report annotated that luck is an enviable quality in any aviator, but it's foolish to rely on it so heavily, so early in one's career. And I think if you put everything down to luck, at some point you will miss out. So I'm definitely not in the do nothing, expect everything to be fine camp. But equally, I'm with you, Hannah. I'm not, oh no, it's all going to go upside down. You've got to think about everything and worry about everything. You can't. But there's a really cool strategy that I came to quite late in life, but that people will be familiar with the name of. So Stoicism, which is passed off as just gritting your teeth and getting on with it. But actually, it's an ancient philosophy in its own right. And another survivor in the book, Dale Stockdale, whose story I won't do to death, but what he described before he was shot down in Vietnam is knowing what you can control and what you can't. Now, Dale was in isolation in the Hanoi Hilton for nearly 8 years. He was in a proper isolation cell for over 4 years with a single light bulb on for a couple of years, shackled. So isolation that we're talking about at home now, nothing compares to what these people have been through. But what the key part to this is, without worrying about everything and what's the worst that could happen and burying yourself in that kind of catastrophic thinking, is to understand the Stoic sense of what can I control and what can't I control. And what these guys have done and girls have done in the past is they've gone, right, if I can control something, what element of it have I got a lever on? If I can do something about it, what can I do? Now, if it's something that we cannot control, And that could be other people's responses to us. That could be big events that are beyond our control. There is absolutely no point worrying and burning your mental energy on that. But there are bits of it that you can control. And even if it's something that's way out of your hands, you can still control your personal response to it. So I think it's key, if you can, to try and chip things down into those compartments. If it's beyond my control, I'm just not going to worry about it. But what can I do about my response to it? And at least then have maybe one or two ideas of how to hack the problem, which is all really military survival is about. We're giving people a template to hack something which is really, really unlikely. You know, we've trained hundreds and thousands of men and women who've gone away to austere places, and very few of them have ever had to use it. So it's something that has to be memorable, but equally you've got to accept that it's unlikely to happen to you. As we say at the very beginning, you know, I hope it doesn't, the real world stuff never happens to anyone who reads the book, but at least by having thought about it, you'll have a response. So that proves the main point, really, that by thinking about things and having a little plan in your back pocket, we can train our brains to perform better in these difficult situations. And that's the key takeaway for most of it, really. It's understanding that there's no such thing as the born survivor. We can all perform better. Everyone brings some strengths to these different scenarios, and it's about maximizing those opportunities, I think. So yeah, knowing what you can control, not worrying too much about what you can't control, and finding that sweet spot between ostrich head in sand and, I don't know, well, woe is me, too many balls in the air kind of thing.
And I think, you know, one of the most important things that you talk about throughout the book, which goes with that, is the fact that, yes, you can write a script and you can imagine things to a certain point, and you have to forget about the things you can't control. But also the key is to be adaptable and to be able to switch your mindset. That's essential. I mean, now we're in this situation. None of us, as I say, could have predicted. We have no script for this. So we can prepare ourselves, but to be adaptable, adapt to the situation is one of the most important things in so many of the stories you describe, and for us all now, and when we cope with daily stressful situations.
Yeah, and it's a difficult one to say, isn't it? It's like, oh, be more adaptable. That's kind of a throwaway line, but the adaptability comes from having the spare capacity to think about the wider parts of the problem, and that comes from having a plan to transpose onto things. The simplest plan that we employ is, it's actually known as PLAN, and this is one of the few abbreviations that I'll stand by. But the way you can think about it more simplistically is just, what's going to hurt me first? And that's what we're teaching people in survival situations. What's going to hurt you first? Address that. So a good example of how that can pan out is when we look back to the story of Amelia Earhart, and she went missing in 1937, around this time of year, sort of 2nd of July 37. So to cut a very, very long and interesting story short, there were a lot of radio transmissions received from Amelia after she'd gone missing. And they coincided with low tide on a specific group of islands. And one of those islands had a flat reef that you could land an aircraft on. And this information was so strong at the time that the US Navy dispatched its biggest ship in the area to go and look at these specific small islands, hundreds of miles away from where she was meant to be. But they'd had all this radio traffic saying, we think she's there. You know, someone on her frequency with her voice transmitting at low tide on the island, and the back bearings from around the Pacific point to the Phoenix Group. So they send the battleship to the Phoenix Group. It went past Nicomarero Island not long after she'd been isolated, about 9 days after. And the airplanes went down the beach next to the long reef and saw signs of recent human habitation, and went back to the battleship and reported that they'd seen signs of recent habitation. But they also said that because nobody came out to sort of wave at them, they didn't land. So they just moved on and searched more islands, and nothing was seen of her since. What they have found on the island since then is items of clothing that look like hers. They found bits of material from a makeup compact. They found a navigator's sextant box. They found bones from a Westerner. Important to note, though, that this stuff from 1937 through to 1940 that's been found, including the sightings of the habitation from the airplanes, that island was uninhabited from 1898. So somebody was struggling there. The problem was that Nicomarero had no fresh water. And this is the bit about adaptability and unpacking the plan part of survival. It's really counterintuitive to put the right items of need in the right order if you've not thought about it first. We teach plan because you've got to protect yourself from the environment, you've got to get rescued, you've got to acquire water and food in that order, and then you've got to navigate or find your way out if you can. So if you were dropped off on a desert island, without any training, you might spend ages looking for something to eat, or you may even look for fresh water. But it's unlikely that on the top of, very near the top of your list will be to write SOS in the sand, because you're aware that airborne search assets might come to look for you. And I'm not slamming Amelia Earhart, and no one's proven that that's definitely what happened. You know, there's a bazillion conspiracy theories online to say that she could be anywhere, but there's a lot of archaeological evidence to prove that someone survived there that fits her profile. And even in the last sort of 12 months, there's been people go out there looking with sonar arrays for the aeroplane. So what's this mean to us in terms of adaptability? Well, if we know that we've got to treat what's going to harm me first in that order, and that would be the environment first, then make sure I get rescued, then acquire water, and then lastly food, it stops us floundering around on the metaphorical beach looking for things to eat, when we should probably be building a shelter or writing help in the sand. And that plan, that protection, location, acquisition, navigation, we can definitely transpose that to our day-to-day. And if we do that, that will build in flexibility and make us more adaptable to more dynamic things that are injected around it. And we see that with students when we're teaching them in the wilderness. You know, on day one, they are literally like rabbits in headlights. But by day 5, they own the woods. And it's around about the day 2, day 3 point when they've seen that this plan really does work. And it's just taking the thinking part out of the problem that they then start to add comfort to their lives. And I've even had younger students who've forgotten their cigarette papers and have made themselves pipes to smoke while they're thinking about what they're going to do. You know, you can build this kind of flexible outlook, and that engenders adaptability. So adaptability is vital, but you can't just generate it off the cuff. You have to have some foundation to put it on. And all the psychology piece that I'm talking about in the book and all the practical bits that we can all do will build that base that you can generate adaptability from, I think.
And some of those things that you those bits of advice, you know, how we can generate adaptability, and most importantly, the thing that we need to get through any situation, hope, which is in a chapter but just comes all the way through the book, the importance of hope. And you know, you've talked about controlling a situation and accepting some of the things that you cannot control, but you say that one of the key pillars of the survival mindset is feeling you have control, and without that feeling we have control, that's when we tend to feel hopeless. I mean, I think obviously now that lack of control is something that a lot of people feel. A lot of people have lost their purpose and their feeling of control over their lives, whether it's their timetable, their commute, their going to a job at all. And you give quite a lot of really helpful, I found incredibly helpful advice, stuff that I hope I've been doing and I'm sure people have picked up, but perhaps we could talk about some of them. One of the things you say to maintain hope is to be able to just do something. The people in the book you describe, the ones who carry on and don't meet rather tragic ends, are the ones who carry on just doing small tasks all the time, looking to the future.
Yeah, and it's a brilliant question, Hannah, because it gets to the very, very root of this. The bit, well, at least I think the bit that I find most interesting. So let's assume that whatever's happened, the bad things occurred, the crash bang wallop's been done, we've worked out what we're going to do, and the dust has settled, and there we are. Right, what happens next? That is entirely down to us. What happens next is on our shoulders. It's that part that we discussed very near the beginning to do with agency and that feeling of control. To kind of take a step back from that, in the past, and certainly even in military survival manuals up until maybe 10, 15 years ago, and definitely in a lot of online stuff, you'll hear people talk about the will to survive. All right, can I have a bottle of will to survive for my survival kit, please? Because I'm going flying in a minute, and you never know, I might crash. So I'd like to have half a litre. That should be fine. Just the will to survive. Yeah. Right. Okay. Yeah. And the John Leach, the psychologist who I've worked with a lot in the past, he says you can insert, instead of will to survive in a lot of these tomes, any kind of hokey sort of thing you like. You can put magic in there, voodoo, whatever, you know, and the sentence will make as much sense if you replace will to survive with a random word like that. So what I've been thinking about for a long time, and leaning on the work of these other psychologists, is what does keep people going in my world when they've got through that initial surge of activity and now they just have to do stuff. And that could be maintain hard graft in the Arctic. It could be carry on walking through the desert at night. It could be hacking their way to make a camp in the jungle. It could be anything, you know, it's something that really looks, when you first see it, as if it's all too much. And I think that taps into your question, because there's a degree of uncertainty at the moment, which is making everything feel like it's just a bit too much. The key to all of this, to maintaining hope, this isn't my lab study. This is American psychologists in the 60s. What they've discovered, and it's been echoed by people like Viktor Frankl, who've witnessed this in places like Auschwitz, with the most horrific end of the spectrum, is that hopelessness isn't born from just suffering. You know, we can all suffer, but we won't necessarily lose our hope. What can extinguish the little candle of hope is that if we're suffering and we feel like we have absolutely no control at all. So if we're suffering, we feel like we can't control it, it looks like it's all a bit much, that can put the little hope candle out. Right, so to reverse that, therefore, in order to have a hope candle that stays lit, we need to feel like we can control our suffering. And the good news is, especially in a period of uncertainty like this, you don't have to master your suffering. You just need to feel like you have an element of control. And that's where the do something bit comes in. Because when I've been in really hard environments with work or with the telly stuff that I've done, you know, you've got a lot on your plate. And if you think about it too much and sit there and try to plan for every eventuality, you won't get up, because some of the places we've been to with work are like, you know, minus 64 still air temperature. If you sit there planning for too long, you'll end up frozen to the ground and they'll have to chip you off. So you've got to do something. And the key thing there is just to know that the goal that you're aiming for doesn't have to be the ultimate life goal at the far end of the range. You can break that journey down into little sections. So find an immediate goal that, like we said earlier, is within what you can control, what you can't. And if it's something like, for me, for the jungle, an easy one is, right, I can clear a small area that I can eventually turn into a habitable space, but I'm going to clear the leaf litter away so there's no scorpion, snakes and stingy bitey things if I want to sit down. Right. By doing that, I have affected my environment. I've changed my environment. I've owned that postage stamp of the jungle, and I now have a little bit of agency. So I needn't have moved anywhere, but by doing something, I've controlled that little bit of the environment through measuring what I can do and how I can affect it. Having a bit of control, as we spoke about a moment ago, means that I've engendered hope. With hope, I can have a vision of the future that contains me, which means I can plan. If I can plan what I'm going to do next, even if that's just cut a few more branches down, I can then begin to work. Cutting the branches down makes the place even more habitable. Ooh, hope. What shall I do next? Plan, work, hope, plan, work. And it's that kind of perseverance engine that was my eureka moment when I was doing the writing, because by unpicking lots of different examples of people who've done it in the past, you can get this engine that spins up, and it's as applicable to the wilderness as it is to my personal nightmare, which is a kind of a bulging email inbox or a meeting that's got seemingly no end. You can apply it absolutely everywhere. And just by feeling like you've got a little bit of control, and some of the other hacks that I've mentioned in the writing that we can possibly chat about, you can spin up this perseverance engine and just keep going. So it could be 1 more meter through the tundra that gets me nearer to a campfire and a cup of tea, or it could be 1 more minute towards the end of the meeting and then I can go home. You know, there's those sorts of things that we can all do. And that applies, I think, to the uncertainty at the moment, because survival isn't a big thing. It's just loads of little things. And going back after lockdown isn't one massive thing. It's just lots of little things. As long as we try to eat the elephant one bite at a time rather than swallowing it in one, we will be okay. But knowing that a little bit of control can engender hope, and hope will allow us to plan, and that work will then hope, plan, work, that perseverance engine can be spun up by our own actions and the things that we can control, is the key to maintaining our morale and our perseverance in these weird times.
There's so many other things there's so many places to go from there. I'm going to pick up on the emails, because that comes all the way through the book, is this sense that survival tips can help us with the modern consumer digital crazy world that clearly sort of stresses you out as much as it stresses lots of us out. And how can these principles of survival help us feel less stressed? You have ways of dealing with a sort of, as you said, bulging inbox and a permanent kind of distraction of social media. How do you apply your military mindset and your survival skills to that?
There's a few ways. Some of them you've probably heard about, and these are just ones that I've adapted to my personal situation. I know that I'll never finish if I start to read Wikipedia. You know, I can't get through it all. If I try to print it out to read later, it just, you know, there's just too much online to distract me. Same with social media, it's bottomless. So those things are just turned off, because I can control whether that distracts me or not, and I've chosen, dink, that's off, right? What do I need? What's going to harm me first? Back to the plan part. If I ignore a really important email from work because I can't be bothered, then I will be harmed in some way. So I'm not stupid enough to mug off everything. You have to be selective. The weird part with this is when you look at your inbox in the morning, there's probably tons of stuff in there. And our brains are wired up for immediate, quick pleasure. We are wired up to hit the low-hanging fruit and, yeah, brilliant, I'm on top of this. And our brains are very bad at planning for longer term. So we will tend, if something looks a bit difficult, to leave it at arm's reach for another day. Wrong. What we have to do is what's going to harm me first, just like protection, location, acquisition, navigation, it's like survival plan. What's the nearest shark to the life raft, and tackle that one first. So I look at my inbox, I've got 20, 30, in the past 80, it used to be really horrific on like it's a normal day. I'll just pick the ones that are really, really, really hard and do those first, because I'm going to be at peak performance first point of the day, get it done, then have a cup of tea, because I've got to set a little bit of a reward for that kind of hard graft. And then the next thing I do is I don't have it on all the time. When we're teaching people like Dale Zelko, who've got a small survival radio and may end up in enemy territory, those things have got a finite battery life. And once it's gone, it's gone. So we teach guys to only use them at certain points in the day. And I've adopted that process to my emails, very similar to an old postal delivery. So morning batch, afternoon batch, and in between it gets ignored because the mailbox isn't open. I get on with other stuff. If it's constantly there, science, not me, but science has proven that if you're interrupted, even if it's just a little red dot just down in the bottom of the screen there, that'll knock you 20 minutes off your immersed creative zone that you're in. And you don't want that if you're working on something that's got an important deadline. So I dial it all down. I use comms windows like an Evader. And I always try to, if I can, I always try to tackle the hard thing first. But equally, I'm not going to be an idiot and expect to get through all of it. I'll have a to-do list which is manageable. It's going to have 5, maybe big items. And then if there is a longer task list, I just keep that somewhere else, because that's going to be a mental burden if I see that every time I try to get a little bit done. So yeah, there's a few of those things which are using the sort of psychology of survival into a really banal scenario like an email inbox that I've employed. But like I said a moment ago, you can kind of transpose this onto absolutely any scenario or particular working paradigm that people are in, whether it be an office-based one or not.
Writing things down is something that you also comes up throughout every one of your list of bits of advice. Write stuff down, make notes, make lists. Is that right?
Yeah, and there's ways of doing it. I've normally always got, where is it? Yeah, this is from my friend at Pilgrim Leathercraft. I've normally always got a notebook to hand. If I'm in the jungle, it's a waterproof one. But what other psychologists in the States have found is that we remember things better, not if we write them, but if we draw them. And I, as a former art student, and my lockdown hair is getting back towards my art student days, I'm a fan of doodling. And it's been proven that because by drawing, we're using different parts of our brain and we're encoding the information in a much deeper, more satisfying way, we'll remember more if we've drawn it. So if I'm doing a talk, I'll use a list in my notebook, but it'll be a list of, it'll look like hieroglyphics to anybody else, but to me, it's a picture that paints literally 1,000 words, and it encodes and chunks a load of information. So I'll have a cascade of pictures that I've drawn, scan that before I go and do the chat, and that then triggers in my brain what comes after the picture of the book. Oh yeah, the picture of the airplane. What comes after that? The picture of the shop. What comes after that? And it'll unload those bits of data into my head. So there are hacks within hacks, and that's one of the ones I use. And if you think about it, there are examples from history of people who've been really effective of using the recall of drawn information. And I won't bang on now about another survival example, but I think Captain Bligh is awesome because he managed to navigate 4,000 odd miles across the Pacific in an open boat with a map that was in his head because he'd drawn it 10 years before. He had some navigational kit, he had a little bit of, compassy, sextanty stuff, but his charts were all in his head and he navigated for 4,000 miles just using stuff he'd drawn. So if you needed a better survival proof that sketching things is better than writing long lists, then yeah, but I always try to unburden my head and put it into a notebook if I can. Do you do that? Is that something you do too?
Yes, I write everything very, very. I go through notebooks faster than you can possibly imagine. I have to write everything down. I find the actual process of writing very, very calming.
Yeah.
But you, in terms of distractions, a lot of what you're saying is that in order to sort of survive these tricky situations we're in, whether they're extreme or not, is to unburden the brain of the unnecessary stuff so we can concentrate on the important stuff. And talking about now and the times we find ourselves in, you refer to scrolling through the news. I'm sure people listening, I certainly will find myself distracted for hours just scrolling through the news. It's something that you talk about in your appendix at the back, just how important that is to reduce stress by managing how much you distract yourself with that.
Yeah, and it ties together a few strands that we've already mentioned, I think, but to apply it to the specific concept of the news at the moment, again, a bit like Twitter or Wikipedia or whatever, you could probably watch the news all day, and some people might, but I'm not one of them. I think what tends to happen if you watch too much of that kind of thing is you're bound to end up on the other end of that worrying scale, because there's so much that could go wrong. And as a friend of mine once quite wisely said when we were doing a bit of TV over in America, is that telly is just the stuff between the adverts. And the news is kind of there to generate revenue for its interested parties. So I tend not to watch the news. And if I do, I certainly don't have it on all the time, because at the moment, events are unfolding quite quickly, but they're not unfolding that quickly that I need rolling news on the base of whatever I'm doing 24/7. So I use a similar technique to the emails. And I've got a structure to my day at the moment, which is really important when you're in a new kind of setup. So I'll check in with the guys at work via different comms means in the morning. We'll check in again at midday, and we'll check in again at 6, a bit like one of those evaded comms windows. But what I'll also do before I check in with the guys is I'll go to a good news source or a works news source so I can pass on any information that they need to know. And by a good news source, personally, I much prefer to go to the horse's mouth. So I'd rather, if it's something to do with the current climate, I'd rather go to the health organizations' websites, or maybe the New Scientist, where it's a peer-reviewed type article, than I would to go through a filter and get someone's interpretation of that information with a potential vested spin on it. And that's not paranoia, that's just me wanting to be a bit more clinical about it.
I think that's really important. In your chapter about Corona, you say that knowledge in all the scenarios is incredibly important. You can't navigate a situation if you don't have information. In fact, you then gave some specific information about this disease that I hadn't looked into. Something had stopped me from doing that. And you're saying that the more you know about your danger and your situation you're in, the better equipped you are to be calmer dealing with it.
Yeah, totally. And that applies to surviving in the desert through to surviving indoors during a pandemic. You know, if you know your enemy, you'll know how to tackle it. If you just get told, do this, then you won't really know why. So I'm sure, well, I'm not sure. I guess that a lot of the people watching, and maybe even you, Hannah, have had texts over the last few weeks from well-meaning but misguided folk saying, drink hot water, it'll kill the virus. No, it won't. But they don't check it, and they send it, and then that information ripples out in a kind of viral form in itself, and that can be damaging. So what I try to do, and it's certainly what we've done for years at the survival school that I work at, and with the manuals and things that I've created for work, is we'll fact check everything. Go to the horse's mouth, find out what's going to kill me first in this particular environment, whether it be an extreme wilderness scenario or, for me personally, the current pandemic. What's the real risk, the real danger? Understand how it works, then I'll remember why I need to do the things I need to do, like hand washing, because as you've probably noticed, I can't help touching myself in the face. People do that 23 times an hour, they reckon, and it's difficult to intercept those habits. There are ways we can work around it, but it's almost impossible to stop it. So if we do things like hand washing regularly, that limits the amount of chance of any viral stuff that we've picked up on our fingers being transmitted to the ways into our body. So it's understanding why people are telling you to do things. Because we've done our best over the last few weeks to break the habits of pre-lockdown and pre-social distancing, but it's going to be very difficult when we ease out of it to not snap back to the way we were. And we need to use those things like Del Zelko's done, the what ifs, and the working out how you're going to cope with a new situation to make sure you have the appropriate responses to survive the next phase. And survive, obviously, I'm thinking mostly about doing it well, not necessarily life-threatening stuff, hopefully not anyway. So yeah, the pandemic annex to the back of the paperback includes loads of stuff about that and how to know your enemy, and importantly as well, know your limits within lockdown and how you can get the most out of a tricky time, because we are all sharing a weird experience. And it's equally and I think at least an opportunity for a bit of growth, because we've got time. We've got time to do something and to make something of this, and maybe change the way we deal with things afterwards as well.
I know some mums with lots of kids who might beg to differ about having time, but you're right, and you talk about the importance in that situation. Generally, obviously, teamwork. Some people are not isolating with other people, but the importance of relationships, human relationships, and of maintaining a sense of humour in all these situations.
Yeah, and the sense of humour thing's vital. It's the last sense to return in a survival situation, and the first sense you lose. I see it all the time, especially if the weather's bad. People just have a sense of humour failure. There's a really cool story, I think, about isolation to do with the person that Robinson Crusoe's based upon. And Alexander Selkirk spent 4 years on an island off the coast of Chile back in the 1700s. He mastered that place. He had everything he needed. He thrived. He was physically robust and fit when he was found, but he was psychologically really, really damaged because he'd been on his own for so long, just spending all his time looking for the right ship. And when the sailors found him, he just collapsed to his knees, cried, and said, "Oh, marooned." That's all he had in him. And that people who've been really, really severely isolated can suffer. It's a real problem. What we can do is this sort of thing. If we've got this amazing modern technology, then we can do what people have done in the past and just have a cup of tea over a chat. And there's a great example that I won't bang on about now, but of lighthouse keepers in the past who used to do that every time they shift changed for half an hour, just to make sure the next person coming on shift was awake and alert, and they did their bit. They really wanted to go and get their heads down, but they did their bit for half an hour, made a big pot of tea, chat, spin up that person's brain, make sure they're okay, and then go to bed. And we can do that for our mates. We can be light keepers. And that sense of humour that you mentioned is key, because if you detect someone who's normally quite upbeat is really, really not hacking it, it's easier to detect that via these visual means, because you can get that non-verbal communication element too.
I'm just I must hand over to audience questions, but I don't want to miss out one really critical part of the book and part of your ethos to do with hope, and it's realistic optimism.
Yes.
There's a tendency in this crisis to imagine deadlines that are going to be over sooner than they might, and to kind of pin our hopes on that. But I'm just interested in how you describe the real danger of false hope, because if we're blindly optimistic, the kind of crushing reality when that doesn't happen is worse than...
Yeah. Brilliant question. The cautious optimism is better than unrealistic optimism. Again, it's back to Jim Stockdale, the guy who was in the Hanoi Hilton for years on end, a philosopher of Stoicism. He was the most senior ranking person in that prison, and what he noticed was that the prisoners who died were optimists, but they were unrealistically optimistic. And they'd say things to themselves like, "We'll be out by Christmas," without a shred of evidence to say they're going to be out by Christmas. Christmas comes, you don't get released. And that these weird dopamine pathways that we touched upon a moment ago when we were talking about Auschwitz and places where people's hope candle can go out, it's that kind of thing that can really crush someone's morale. I'm not suggesting for a second that this is going to happen. If lockdown goes on a bit, people aren't going to be crushed, but you've got to be realistic about your optimism. If you've got absolutely no evidence to say things are going to be fine, then don't expect them to be fine yet. Like we were saying earlier, don't set too hard a target for yourself. Be realistic about your planning and what you can achieve, because unrealistic optimism in the worst case scenario, really, really bad times in the past, that has turned people's brains off and they've died. So it can have a psychological effect. Your optimism has to be tempered by reality, and it's best to be cautiously optimistic rather than hopelessly over-optimistic, and best to be cautiously optimistic rather than really, really blasé, because that's when you put yourself at physical risk.
Thank you. I'm going to take I'm so glad that the first question I can see is one of the things on my list that I would have, that it's a bit of a variation. We were going to talk about panic and we haven't, but the question says, how do you manage the adrenaline, a similar thing, and its effects in surprise situations?
That's a brilliant question. Brilliant. Managing it is the right thing to ask as well, because you can't necessarily control it in the instant. The way we behave is hardwired into us. We've evolved for hundreds of thousands of years at walking pace in hot savanna type landscapes to hunt and gather. That is what our version 1.0 Homo sapiens does. And we are still version 1.0. So what we've now got is a load of enclosed Homo sapiens mooching around cities with brains that are geared up for walking space in sparse environments, but we are surrounded by traffic flashing past and almost silent dispatch cyclists and that kind of thing. And that's what we'll be easing back into as well. So it'll be doubly difficult. The long grass of the savannah can hold opportunities like small antelope. It can hold threats like snakes or threats like leopards, or it could just be the grass moving in the wind. And our brains have spent hundreds of thousands of years watching these patterns and working that out. And one of the best things to do if you see the grass move is do nothing, just wait, because it could be a deer, which means dinner time. But if we move and it's a leopard, then, oh, hello, that might mean dinner time for it, and we could be on the menu. If it's a snake, we might have to jump back. So our brains tend to pause. What it will also do in that pause moment, though, is the guy or girl who asking the question probably already knows, is it'll prepare us for one of those responses. Almost in an instant, we'll be dumped with adrenaline and cortisol, importantly, so that we can tackle the threat. Now, that could be by fighting, flight, or freezing, as dictated by our ancestral kind of programming. That adrenaline dump and that cortisol dump won't help us if it happens every single time we see a red dot on the email, because that's generating stress. But that's our programming, human 1.0, and that's what happens. So what we can do is we can tap into our ancestors' older responses. The one thing that will lower those kinds of chemicals in our system is doing what we would do after a successful hunt. After a successful hunt in the savannah, we'd sit under a nice shady tree and eat our meal around a little campfire and relax. And so one of the best things we can do to lower those stress hormones is just to rest and digest, to trigger that opposite response to fight, flight, or freeze. And an easy way to do that is to chew. And a good psychologist friend of mine called Sarita Robinson has done research which proves that just chewing, that mastication, lowers the breathing rate, it lowers the stress chemicals, it puts us into a rest and digest mode rather than a fight and flight mode. And all we're doing there is understanding, like we said earlier, Hannah, understanding the programming that's going on underneath, why things are happening, what the enemy is, and how to tackle it. So that's a great one. I chew chewing gum when I'm driving as well, because that's quite a high tempo sort of activity that potentially, if you don't pay attention for the right period of time, you could end up on your roof with your wheels spinning, couldn't you? So that's a good one. Breathing exercises are a brilliant way of doing it. So counting to 4 while you breathe in, hold it for 4, count to 4 as you breathe out. That again will lower those adverse chemicals.
So question says, do you think having a go, I'm not laughing at the question, it's a great question. I'm just thinking of people I know who have. Do you think having a go bag ready is too paranoid? If not, what would you say are the top things to have in your bag?
Brilliant. Depends where you're going, doesn't it? So when I'm going on a helicopter into the jungle, yes, I will have some kit that means I can camp more comfortably with what's kind of in my pockets. I'll take extra bits. Interestingly though, when we at work, when we look at vehicles like that have slammed in, people who get out generally forget them. They generally leave them behind because normally something really bad's happening. It's like stuck in a precarious position or burning, and they'll tend to just go out with what's in their pockets. So personally, grab bag, I don't do it day to day. I'm not that kind of guy, but I'll have bits in my pockets that help me out. And things that help me out, well, the smartphone's amazing, isn't it? Because there's no end of utility in the apps that are on it. But I also normally take with me a spare battery and a lead, because that's the kind of thing these days in our modern context that will bail us out of trouble. If I was going somewhere really austere, I'd probably take a first aid kit and a rescue beacon. I've got them. I'm lucky I've done a bit of stuff like this in the past, so I can work around camping with less kit. But if I didn't have any of that, or I was going somewhere really nippers, I'd make sure I had the right kit to maintain my body temperature. But yeah, kit's an amazing question because you go on about it all day, and I hope I don't. But the best bit of training you can get, if you wanted to know about survival training to add on to that, is just get some first aid training, because it can save yours or a friend's life.
And another question is, any tips for staying calm in a communication like block out? If we couldn't communicate, how you might prepare for that? So I think what they mean is proper isolation when you can't communicate with outside world.
Yeah, and if we're looking at the how to work around this kind of tech failing, I'm quite well practiced at that because the cottage I'm in doesn't have a phone line. So triple redundancy on comms is something I'm quite used to. Probably get an old mobile phone, a burner phone with a different SIM on it that patches into a different network. And if you're looking at just getting information, and if you have a car, you've actually got a radio that runs off a battery, because your car's got a battery and the radio in it will probably still dial into the old frequencies that aren't digital. So there are ways of gathering information. I mean, I'm not going to start saying use mirrors to flash semaphore signals across the other side of the valley. That's a little bit old school. But it's interesting to note that in the Second World War, the RAF aircraft that were flying over Germany all carried 2 pigeons, because that was the only way to get the information back. So, you know, you could go all the way back to really daft answers, but ultimately there's a primary, alternative and contingency emergency layer that we have with comms in my world. Primary, alternate, contingency, emergency, just known as PACE. So we'll have the primary means, which will be, you know, the radio. Then we'll have an alternative, and then you're getting into things like pigeons and messages and bottles, you know, down in the weeds of it.
I mean, we don't need necessarily to use it in our everyday lives, but you do offer some great tips about, for example, I mean, I've never known how to tell from the sun and from the moon where north, south, east and west is. Perhaps you could share those, and I'll come to
Yeah, sure. A quick one, because at the moment we're on a sort of a half moon, aren't we? A quick one that you can do probably now, because what is it now? It's about 7:30. The sun's way over that way where I'm sat. If you look in the sky towards the south, you'll see the half moon if the sky's clear. You draw a line from the top to the bottom of that crescent moon. That line extended down to the horizon will point roughly to south. And when it gets darker later, you'll still see the moon, but as it gets even darker, turn around, look the other way, and to find the North Star, I'm afraid you're going to have to buy the book.
No. Are you going to do that?
It's easy. There's a million apps. You look for the Big Dipper, you go from the far end of the Big Dipper, there's 2 stars called the Pointers, and then 5 times that, the brightest star in that region is Polaris. It's not the brightest star in the sky, but it's the 48th brightest if anyone's doing a pub quiz later. But it's there on its own, and that's north. But do buy the book.
So someone says, do you think survivalism, bushcraft training, these sorts of things should be part of the school curriculum?
Oh, that's a good question. I do think getting young people into the outdoors early should be part of the school curriculum. It's a net benefit from doing survival and bushcrafty stuff. You definitely get a self-reliance from doing these things. And interestingly, some of the examples I cite in the book, people like Fred Spencer Chapman, who did really, really well in the jungles of Malaysia during the Second World War, were schooled at places like Gordonston that specialised in being practical and doing outdoorsy things. I was really lucky. I was an air cadet back when I was a lot younger. And one of the things that I think is a brilliant scheme and that young people can get into is the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme, because that has got a really good self-reliance outdoors element to it. And that's one of the things that's kind of the genesis of that is way back up to Gordonston School, where the Duke of Edinburgh studied himself. But equally, you know, there's loads of ways you can slide it into the curriculum if you've got the luxury of the time in the program. I do think it's useful. There are other ways to get it if your school won't provide it though. Duke of Edinburgh's a great one.
Unbelievably, we've come already to the end of the hour, and I'm always wary that we might get cut off if I don't wrap it up. But some people have said, they asked, will the book be available on audio? And I can tell you, yes, it is on audio. And also, you'll be sent a link shortly after the talk to a link to be able to rewatch the talk back online, and to, I think, the independent bookseller where you can buy John's book. But John, thank you so very much for talking to us. Lots of things to think about, and thank you all very much indeed for joining.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's been great.
Thank you.